Welcome back, America. We only have a few minutes left in the show, but we want to stay on this extraordinary story of the historic debt ceiling negotiations playing out in Washington. To say the next 48 hours are going to be momentous to the future of the country is to be an understatement. And we have a perfect guest to wrap things up for us tonight. Brandon Arnold is the Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union, someone who's been fighting to keep an eye on your dollars here in Washington for a long time. He always has his finger on the pulse of what taxpayers are looking for regarding this deal. Brandon, great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Your top line of the deal that Kevin McCarthy negotiated this weekend, good, bad, in the middle, how do you rate it?
I think it's pretty good, and I know that differs a lot from my friends in the Freedom Caucus here. But listen, I think when you have an opportunity to cut hundreds of billions of dollars from our federal deficit, perhaps even trillions of dollars based on some preliminary estimates, you take it. You take it and then you move on to the next fight. Obviously, there's a lot more work that needs to be done to get our fiscal condition back where it needs to be. But here's an opportunity to lock in some savings, to claw back some of those IRS dollars, to make sure people are paying their student loans as they promised they would years and years ago, but haven't done for 3 years, to open up American energy more so than it exists now with permitting reform. There's a lot of good stuff in this bill. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty good step in the right direction.
Brandon, there is another top line that stuck out to me, especially as someone who filed an extension and hasn't filed her taxes yet. I'm worried about these 87,000 new IRS agents that are still there.
Yeah, that's a huge problem and something that we've been fighting quite a bit at National Taxpayers Union, as you would expect. And what we'd like to see is, first of all, that number reduced from $80 billion that went to the IRS in the Inflation Reduction Act as low as we can possibly get it. And this bill does so a little bit. And shifting that money, I think, is really important, because what we want the IRS to do is to do what we pay it to do. That is, process tax returns, answer the phones, respond to emails and letters, to make sure people can understand what they're filling out when they do their taxes each and every year, so they're not making mistakes, so they're not necessitating enforcement actions. The Democrats just want to ramp up the enforcement activities to go in and audit people and harass people. I'd rather people not make mistakes in the first place, because they were able to get an IRS agent on the phone, an IRS representative on the phone to answer their questions so they can do things properly.
Yeah, man, that would be a big change from the last few years of record of achievement, or lack thereof, at the agency. Brandon, there obviously is going to be some broken trust, and with only 4 votes to spare on most votes, Kevin McCarthy's going to have to win back the Freedom Caucus somehow. It seems to me that no matter how this deal turns out on the vote in the next couple of days, focusing on the 2024 budget, where a lot more meat can be taken off of the spending bone in Washington, that could be a reuniting moment. Tell us, what are the key steps Kevin McCarthy has to do to get to that next level that would make everyone, you and the Freedom Caucus, feel a lot better?
Yeah, what I think needs to happen here is we need to be much more scrutinous when it comes to federal spending. And we've given a free pass. When I say we, I mean conservatives, Democrats, you name it. We've given a free pass to the government time and time again, whether we were in control, whether we were in the minority, what have you. We need to reinvigorate the appropriations process. And this, one of the things that the bill does is actually require bills to go through the appropriations process. We haven't completed the appropriations process, all 12 bills, in decades. So if you don't do it, if you don't go through that appropriate process, then you're looking at a 1% reduction in discretionary spending. This is going to give conservatives many more bites at the apple than we've had, again, for decades. An opportunity to amend bills, to strike earmarks, to strike wasteful spending. So I think this is a really good thing, to have a more democratic House of Representatives and Senate, to make sure that people, whether they're in power, they're the Speaker or Senate President, or whether they're a backbencher in their first term, have a say in the budgeting process.
Good point.
Brandon, regarding the way that I think this was kind of sprung on Republicans, as we heard from Congressman Andy Biggs and Scott Perry, they felt like this was kind of run over on them and they didn't really have the opportunity. So I'm worried about the optics for Republicans, because when they passed that first bill out of the House, granted, it wasn't ever going to pass the Senate and it wasn't ever going to get signed by Biden, but it was a win for them. Now, Republicans, McCarthy has to go back to Congress and deal with Republicans, and now that win has turned into a loss. How do they salvage it?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult. And honestly, I blame this on Biden to a large extent, because this process should have begun in January or February of this year. Instead, we waited till late April, and that put us behind the 8 ball. If we would have had a plan early in January, if Biden would have been willing to sit down with Republicans instead of just burying his head in the sand and pretending like this debt ceiling problem wasn't going to come to a head in a matter of months, then I think we could have gotten ahead of it. We could have had a more participatory process, and we could have involved a lot of suggestions from the Freedom Caucus in the ultimate piece of legislation. But at the end of the day, we are dealing with a tough situation here. We have a very narrow majority in the House of Representatives, and Republicans don't control the Senate or the White House. So we can only expect so much to come out of these negotiated processes. We can't win on every single front. Of course, Biden has some sway in this. Of course, Schumer has some authority here because we've got to get this bill through the Senate and signed by the president. So we're not going to score as many Freedom Caucus type wins as we'd like.
We're going to have to leave it there just because we're coming to the other show. Really appreciate your insights, folks. Thanks for joining us today. Big conversation, a lot of history to play out. We're going to turn it over to our good colleague, Grant Stinchfeld, right now.